With the door and the door frame complete, we're going to create the glass texture that appears inside the window portion of the door. I'm first going to merge all the components of the door frame by shift selecting those elements and hitting Command E. And I'll rename it door frame, and I'll turn both the door frame and the door off for the moment. And I'm going to put a blank white layer in for the tutorial, and I'll put a new layer above it. And I'll hit M on the keyboard to get my marquee. I'm going to fill this with a 50% gray. Going to my swatches, and I'll use my paint bucket by hitting G or Option or Alt Delete to fill it. We're going to be using the dodge and burn tool, and we want this to look almost like a cylinder when it's done. To use the dodge and burn tool, we would hit O on the keyboard, and it'll take us to those tool settings. There are 3 tools there. There's one that looks like a white lollipop, called a dodge tool, which will make the gray lighter in value, and then the little hand called the burn tool will make it darker. And I'll start with the little hand, and I'm going to set my brush opacity to I'm going to set my brush hardness to 10%, and I'll start by making my brush size 175, and I'll hold the shift key and I'll drag down over the edge of the rectangle. And I'll do that on either side. So we will have dark values on either side and lighter values in the center, and it'll look kind of cylindrical when it's done. You'll need to kind of do this a few times to build up the value. I have the exposure set for 30. If I wanted to, I could make that higher or lower, and it would give me darker value. Now I want it to be lighter in the center, so I'll switch and I'll use the dodge tool. I'll set the hardness to 0, and I'll set the brush size 175 as well, and I'll drop the exposure down from 100 to maybe 40 to begin with. The lower the number, the more the opportunity is to rework the area until you get exactly what you want. Now I know with values, when we look at a 3D surface like a sphere or a cylinder, there's a point at which the light is very, very bright and thin, depending on how the light hits it. So I'm going to make the brush smaller, and I'm going to make the exposure higher. And this is very subjective, and it's something you'll need to experiment and play with till you get exactly what you want. I'll make the brush smaller once again, increasing the exposure maybe to 70, and I'll shift and drag through on that light value. I'll make the brush a little bit smaller, and I'll make the exposure 80%, and I'll build the value a little bit lighter there. And in order to use it in our door, we're going to taper it. We'll need 9 of these from left to right to fit inside the opening of the door. We'll begin by scaling our layer and tapering it so it's narrower. I'll make a selection of it using my marquee, and if I hit V on the keyboard and I hold my Option and my Shift key, I can drag another copy of it to the right. I'll hit Command H to hide the selection, so as I drag the other copies, I don't have the distraction of marching ants on the edge. I'll deselect, and now I'm going to turn on the layers for the door and the frame, and I'll put this layer below the door and I'll scale it. I'll give it a little more width, and we should have something like this. Now we want to tint the glass. With that layer selected, I'll put a new layer in. Going to my swatches, I'll choose a blue, and on that blank layer named Tint, I'll make a selection that fits over the glass, and I'll use Option Delete to fill it. Now I'll choose a blend mode so I can see through the tint to the glass texture below. Once I've selected a blend mode I want, I'm going to go back down to the glass layer itself, and I'm going to put Bevel and Emboss on it. Going to FX, I'll choose Bevel and Emboss, and I'm going to choose Texture. And in the patterns, I'll click and I'll select a pattern that I can put kind of a texture on. There are any number of these you may want to experiment with. And when you choose one, you'll see you have the option to adjust the size and the depth. And we should have something like this.